on. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome, everyone. On behalf of the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, I'd like to thank you for joining us for today's webinar titled, How Can We Increase Clean Energy in the Southeast Through the EPA's Clean Power Plan? My name is Erin Cameron, and I'm the Development and Outreach Coordinator for SACE. For those of you not familiar with SACE, we are a regional organization focused on promoting responsible energy choices that create global warming solutions and ensure clean, safe, and healthy communities throughout the Southeast. We are a membership organization, and I'd like to thank all of our members on this call today and encourage those of you who are not members to please join us today. We are in the middle of our fall member campaign, and you can become a member by simply going to the donate page on our website, cleanenergy.org. Our members help to make our work and programs like this possible, so thank you very much for your support. Before we get started today, I actually want to take a moment to review the basic functions of the control panel on your screen. If you'd like to minimize your control panel, just select the orange arrow in the left-hand corner, and then select the arrow again to display the panel. To ensure sound quality, all of the attendee lines will be muted throughout the presentation, but we encourage you to please type in any questions you may have in the questions box on your control panel, and we will answer all of the questions at the end of the presentation today. Our presenters today will be Simon Mahan, SACE Renewable Energy Manager, and Angela Garoni, SACE Southeast Energy Research Attorney. Simon is responsible for overseeing the organization's promotion of clean energy with a focus on onshore wind energy within the region, offshore wind, and wind energy transmission. Simon specializes in policy advocacy, energy analysis, and stakeholder engagement. Previously, he worked as an advocate and analyst for an ocean conservation organization in Washington, D.C., addressing offshore wind economics, industrial energy efficiency, and mercury reduction policies. He earned his BS in political science at Missouri State University with minors in biology and communications. Angela is SACE's Southeast Energy Research Attorney and works on coal retirement issues in the TVA area and throughout the region, as well as carbon policies across the Southeast. Angela graduated cum laude from Pace University Law School with a certificate in environmental law and attended George Washington University's Energy and Environmental Law LLM program. And now to get us started today, I'm going to turn it over to Angela.
Great, thanks, Erin, and welcome everybody on Friday to learn a little more about EPA's Clean Power Program, Clean Power Plan rather, and here's some recommendations from SACE on how we think it could actually be strengthened to prioritize clean energy solutions in the Southeast. So some of you may have joined us for our previous webinars on the Clean Power Plan, so I'm going to go rather quickly through the basics, and you can always refer back to SACE's webinar archive if you want to go in a little more detail about the really basics around the Clean Power Plan. But first off, I wanted to just say, you know, the basics of the Clean Power Plan are that they propose a state emission goal, which is expressed as a rate, so pounds of CO2 per megawatt hour. EPA allowed for that rate to be converted to a mass-based rate, so that would be more like the traditional cap of CO2 pounds. They've included alternate state goals, which we'll hear a little more about, and there's also an issue about the baseline years from which these goals start from. So basically, where is the baseline starting that leads to the 2030 state goal? EPA set the goals based on the state's generation portfolio and attempted to make it flexible for states based on their unique generation makeup. The Clean Power Plan sets out guidelines for the development of and submission and implementation of the state plans, so each state will have to show how they will comply. The timeline for the Clean Power Plan, the proposed Clean Power Plan came out in June of this year, and the public comment period ends December 1st, which is only about 2 weeks away. The final rule is scheduled to be published in June of 2015, and state compliance plans will begin to be submitted ranging 2016 to 2018. That range is because EPA has built in some extensions for states who choose to do multi-state compliance plans or who show that they need an extra amount of time based on their individual concerns. The ultimate goal that states need to reach as far as reducing their emissions will be 2030. So very quickly, the basics around the Clean Power Plan, so how EPA gets to actually setting the state goals, is something called the Best System of Emission Reductions, BSER. The best system of emission reductions in the Clean Power Plan is based on these 4 carbon-reducing building blocks, is what they're referring to them as. So as you can see here, the first one is increasing efficiency of the coal-fired power fleet currently. The second one is increasing efficiency in dispatch and the use of existing natural gas combined cycle plants. Number 3 is increase of zero carbon generation sources. So this is solar, wind. It also includes nuclear generation. And the 4th building block is the increased use of demand-side energy efficiency measures. We will be focusing on building blocks 3 and 4 for the purposes of this webinar. So just quickly, this is a slide we've shown before in other webinars, but I wanted to show really what we're talking about for the Southeast. So here we have the states that SACE either works in or monitors. The asterisk are ones that we just monitor. We don't actively work in, but as you'll see, each state's goal is different based on where they started in 2012, which is the proposed baseline. The percentages are how much of a reduction that emission goal represents from where states started in 2012. And I also wanted to touch just very briefly on the public health benefits. I think it's important when we think about these rules and the cost of these rules that really the benefits have a cost value and will actually be pretty significant, because a lot of the pollution outside of carbon pollution that comes from coal plants are the ones that really damage public health, and they will necessarily be reduced while we reduce carbon emissions from coal plants. So here you can see that the benefits significantly outweigh the cost. You have public health and climate benefits ranging from 55 billion to 93 billion in 2030 versus only a 7 to 8 billion cost to comply. So obviously it's very much heavy on the benefits there versus the cost. Here you'll see that they reduce exposure to dangerous particle pollution, that decreases ozone levels, which leads to reduction in everything from premature deaths to a reduction in productivity from missed school and work days. Additionally, in a clean energy economy, will increase our health, because every public health, every $1 spent on implementation of the rule, we will see $7 in savings from the health benefits due to the reduction of soot and smog emissions from coal plants. And so, as I said, I'm about to hand it over to Simon to focus on building block 3 for the renewable energy, and then he will hand it back to me and finish up with building block 4. So without further ado, Simon, take it away.
Okay. And hopefully you should all be seeing what I'm seeing now. Can you confirm?
Yes.
Okay, great. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Simon Mahan. I'm the Renewable Energy Manager for the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy. I'm based in the beautiful city of Lafayette, Louisiana, but I generally cover wind energy work throughout an 11-state region, generally referred to as the South. So today, I'm going to quickly discuss renewable energy in building block 3. As Angela mentioned, nuclear is also in there, but I will be focusing on renewables. I also discuss the 2 primary targets that EPA has proposed, that they've given out. There are the proposed targets, and then there are the alternative targets. What I'll do with both of these is kind of explain EPA's thinking and how they came up with those different targets, and try to show some limitations to some of those, and then finally wrap up with some recommendations that we'll be giving to EPA going forward. But there are 2 major things I want everybody to take away from this webinar today. First, that the EPA estimates for renewable energy across the board are grossly underestimating renewable energy potential in the South. And then the second thing is that the states in our region can very easily meet the EPA targets, even more stringent EPA targets than what they're stating right now, by using renewable energy. So it's not all bad news. There is some good news. So let's first talk about the proposed targets. Typically, these are the targets that folks focus on when discussing the EPA emission rate, but also the renewable energy generation. the way these targets are created from EPA is that they're based off a regionalized state RPS requirements, and what that means is that you can see here in the map that they've regionalized all these states into EPA regions. So here we are in EPA Region 4, and they've taken the renewable portfolio standards that have been passed in the states in those regions and regionalized them. Well, here in our region, in EPA Region 4, we have one renewable portfolio standard. It's the North Carolina REPS, and so EPA bases a cap off of that REPS program, and then also they evaluated what the growth rate of renewable energy is in that state because of the REPS. So we've got two different figures here. One is there's a cap of 10% of renewable of generation from 2012, and that 10% cap is for renewable generation in the year 2030. And then the generation rate is at 13% per year for each one of these states. So if a state gets to 10% of the 2012 generation using renewable energy at any time between now and 2030, the way EPA looks at it is as if they stop building additional renewable energy generation resources. Alternatively, if a state cannot reach that 10%, they just continue to grow until the year 2030 when the program, when the deadline ceases. So the way they do this is they take a state's existing non-hydro renewable generation from 2012. That information's from EIA, and those figures are fairly non-controversial and are historical. They multiply those figures by the regional renewable energy growth rate, which again is 13% within our EPA Region 4. Virginia, Arkansas, and Louisiana are in different EPA regions, so their figures are slightly different than ours. But that's generally how they come up with these estimates for our states. And here's where kind of the money, or where the rubber hits the road, is on what the proposed targets mean in terms of renewable energy generation for each one of these states. So as you can see, there's several states that do hit the 10% goal by the 2030, including Florida, Georgia, Mississippi, North Carolina, and South Carolina. And then you may be looking at Kentucky and saying, well, what's going on there? Well, since the proposed target is based on the amount of 2012 renewable generation, then it's multiplied by this 13% growth rate. So if you for an extreme example, if you multiply 0 times 0, you're going to get 0. And so in this fashion, the proposed targets actually kind of give a benefit to laggard states that really haven't done anything with renewable energy, like Kentucky, and also like Tennessee. On the flip side, because there's the 10% cap, some states will actually meet that 10% goal before 2030, and those states tend to be, I think, Georgia, and then let's see here, Mississippi, and I think South Carolina as well. So they meet the goal for EPA in 2025, 2026, 2027, even before the 2030 deadline. And here's the big different approach. It's called an alternative approach, and instead of taking the regionalized RPSs, what EPA is doing is that they're relying on NREL technical potential, Energy Information Administration generation levels, but also EIA cost estimates, which are just terrible for renewable energy. And they look at general market expansion rates for each individual type of renewable generation. So a big difference between the proposed and the alternative is that in the proposed, EPA just says you have to meet this target somehow through some form of renewables. And in the alternative, they say, okay, well, we think you have more solar, and so it's likely that you would meet a target using more solar. It's not a requirement that you have to have that much solar or a certain amount of wind, but that's how they ultimately come up with these different goals. But there's two different methodologies even within this separate approach. One methodology is a benchmark approach, and the other is the integrated planning model, or the IPM model that folks may have heard about. So with the benchmark, what they do is they take the state's renewable energy technical potential from NREL, and they multiply that by a technology-specific development rate average. So the figures they came up with was an average build-out of that state's wind energy potential by 9% per year. And for solar, the figure they ended up using was 0.009% per year, so extremely low levels. For biomass, only existing biomass was included, and they also included hydropower, but for hydro, they did something a little funny between the two. And EPA also did not evaluate offshore wind potential at all. They just didn't even bother with it. For geothermal, none of our states came up with any geothermal potential at all based on the way some of these methodologies were done. So here's what you end up getting if you apply the EPA benchmark methodology to our states. And as you can see, it's not very impressive at all. For this, EPA looked at the historical development rates and multiplied it by the in-state renewable generation potential based on old NREL data. But for hydropower, they actually looked at the NREL data, which is actually new hydropower potential. It's not existing hydropower. And again, here you can see they didn't look at offshore. They didn't really even look at biomass, and geothermal comes up as a big zero as well. These figures are in gigawatt hours in the year 2030, but if you were to turn it into capacity, just to give folks a different feel for it, it's about 2,000 2 gigawatts, or about 2,000 megawatts worth of solar capacity, and a bit less than a gigawatt of wind power capacity, or about 1,000 megawatts for the entire region. So these are very, very low levels of renewable energy capacity build out by the year 2030 based on the alternative benchmark. The other way that EPA looked at this alternative was something called the IPM model. And this is what the IPM model looks like. So in here, they use some NREL technical potential figures. They're over here in Chapter 4. Just trust me on that. And then also they use some EIA cost estimates for capital construction for renewable generation, which those are up here in Chapter 8. The NREL figures that they've used, especially for wind, are really outdated and not reflective of the current technology. And the EIA numbers, as I mentioned before, that for the capital costs of renewable generation are grossly out of line with reality. And they're consistently lambasted by the renewables community for being so out of touch. So when you use the IPM model in all of its complexity, this is what you end up getting. For many of our states, solar and wind just get completely zeroed out. With IPM, they are able to look at existing biomass, and they also do look at hydropower. These again, these figures are in gigawatt hours, so we're a little ahead in terms of total renewable generation potential based on the IPM targets over the benchmark targets, but these still are not good numbers. The regional capacity for solar would be about 4.7 gigawatts, or about 4,700 megawatts, and for wind it would be about 1.8 gigawatts, or 1,800 megawatts. But here, if you recall in the benchmark, Arkansas actually had substantially higher wind potential, and here they basically have none. Alternatively, North Carolina's wind potential gets a big boost in this IPM model, but their solar potential takes a big dive compared to the IPM model. So IPM is better in some instances than the benchmark, and in other instances the benchmark is better than IPM. But that's not it's a good side note, but the EPA's actual alternative approach targets are based on the lowest value between the benchmark and the IPM model for solar and wind. So they take these two figures and they say, what's the most conservative value that we could use? And let's use that as the target. So these are the actual numbers for the alternative targets that EPA is proposing. So we had kind of two different methodologies to come up with this. And then for solar and wind, EPA said, well, what's the lowest number that we could come up with? And I've highlighted the different figures here to show you where the numbers are being pulled from, whether they're from the benchmark methodology or the IPM methodology. So in some cases, the benchmark is worse, and in some cases, the IPM model is worse. It just so happens that in most of the cases, the IPM model is the worst out of these. But on hydropower, as I mentioned earlier, EPA does something a little funny where they actually pick the highest of the estimates out of the benchmark and the IPM. So they're not even applying a same standard for renewable generation across the board. They're kind of picking and choosing different standards depending on the different type of resource. Okay, so this is where we can really weigh the difference between the proposed targets and the alternative targets. And as you can see, if you put them side by side here in terms of gigawatt hours or even in terms of percentage of 2012 generation, the proposed targets are way, way better than the alternative targets. And it's because, again, they're based off of the regionalization of North Carolina's REPS program. But even with that, as I mentioned before, the proposed targets aren't all that great, even though they're certainly better than the alternative. Now, our region is a bit unique in that every state, the proposed targets are better than the alternative approach, but that's not the case across the country. For example, for some plain states like Kansas, Iowa, South Dakota, and Nebraska, the technical potential, basically the alternative targets, is much greater than the regionalized RPSs or the proposed targets. So the alternative targets are stronger than the proposed targets, and that's true for about 15 states across the country. And it tends to be states where they have a lot of wind potential, but the RPSs are fairly weak for the region. Okay, so now that I'm done with my version of the children's book Alexander and the Terrible, Horrible, No Good, Very Bad Day, what's the good news? How can we make these regulations better? Well, one of the things that we will be recommending is that they need to evaluate, EPA needs to evaluate and allow out-of-state energy purchases. So when TVA purchases wind energy from outside of their footprint, they need to be credited for that. One of the big projects that's happening that will impact our region is a transmission project called the Clean Line Plains and Eastern Transmission Project. And it's meant to connect up to 3,000 megawatts or more of high capacity, low cost wind energy from Oklahoma and tie those directly into Arkansas and into Tennessee. So if Arkansas and Tennessee are purchasing that energy and it's being delivered directly to those states, we think they need to be credited for purchasing those resources. And it's not a one-off sort of thing. Many of our utilities within the region are purchasing wind energy. It just happens to be from out of the state and even out of the region. So Alabama Power is purchasing 404 megawatts of wind energy. The Arkansas Electric Cooperative Corporation, they're purchasing over 200 megawatts. Georgia Power will be purchasing more than 250 megawatts. TVA is purchasing more than 1,500 megawatts of wind energy, and then SWEPCO here in Louisiana is purchasing over 400 megawatts of wind energy. So we think if a utility is going to buy a carbon-free energy resource for their generation portfolio and the electricity is delivered to their footprint, that they should be credited for that. These next two bullet points, that EPA needs to update their technology assessments and also update their cost assessments, are really geared towards the alternative approach. Now, even though the alternative approach is terrible, it needs to be fixed, because perhaps the worst thing that could happen, the worst outcome, is for EPA to choose the alternative approach and not use the right information. Additionally, as state regulators start to look to developing their state implementation plans, they're going to be relying heavily on EPA input and data, and if EPA input and data are half a decade to a decade behind the reality of the market, it's going to make it that much more difficult to explain to the state regulators that, no, the EPA is wrong on this, and here are the right numbers. The next bullet here is that we need to have a better methodology, and we've looked pretty heavily into incorporating an updated methodology from the Union of Concerned Scientists. I'll speak more about that here in a moment. And then finally, this last point is that energy efficiency and renewables for emission reduction need to be credited properly, and this is in reference to the Notice of Data Availability released by the EPA about 2 weeks ago. It's still fairly new. Folks are still trying to figure out what all it means. But basically, the EPA calculates natural gas's impact on carbon emissions differently than renewables and energy efficiency. And the way they do it effectively gives gas more credit for reducing carbon emissions than zero-emitting renewables such as and efficiency. So this is kind of the debate between whether or not renewable generation needs to be put in the denominator and the numerator. If you'd like some more information on that, we can provide that. But basically, what needs to happen is that for every megawatt of renewable and energy efficiency, they need to properly account for emissions reductions for that. So the next slide here, we're going to talk just briefly about the Union of Concerned Scientists Demonstrated Growth approach. Their new methodology found out that they basically found out that EPA's proposed targets were not much better than the Department of Energy's projections on a business as usual case. And in the near term, the EPA's targets for this Clean Power Plan were actually a little bit worse than business as usual. So so UCS, the Union of Concerned Scientists, applied some common sense tweaks and came up with stronger but reasonable target levels. And their approach first addresses some inadequacies with the EPA's proposed and alternative approaches. Second, they better reflect the current and projected market development trends for renewable energy. And third, it's technically and economically feasible within our region. So if you have any more questions about that, it's really great. I'd recommend you check it out, but we can talk more about it later or offline. So this is where some additional updated information about wind energy and solar would be helpful for not only providing comments to EPA, but also to the state regulatory agencies when you go talk to them. First and foremost, wind turbine technology has advanced pretty substantially in the past 5 years. And generally what this chart is showing here is that in wind regimes of 6 meters per second, which tends to be what our region has, costs have declined by about 39% in the past decade. And this price over here, those are in prices, dollars per megawatt hour. So prices have continued to go down, and we expect that trend to continue. It's in part because the turbines are getting taller and the blades are getting longer. So costs are coming down, and as part of that, we've actually seen wind projects being proposed in every single one of the states in the South, which would not have happened about 5 years ago. With these newer turbine technologies that we have, the potential, renewable energy potential, is much, much greater than what EPA is using. So these are new estimates coming out of NREL from late of 2013 and early 2014. But basically, there are now over 134 gigawatts or 134,000 megawatts of wind energy potential throughout the region. And in some states where there's historically been associated no wind potential, like Mississippi, they just kind of jump off the charts. So Tennessee, Mississippi, and Louisiana now have more than 25,000 megawatts of wind energy potential. And that's at, I think, a 35 or a 40% capacity factor. So it's high capacity wind energy. And if you were to look at taller turbines from a 96 meter hub height to 110 meter hub height, this is where NREL has found those new generation resources could exist. So a darker green area is better than a lighter green area. There's still a huge resource here in the middle of the country, but those resources already exist. So these are brand new resources that they had not seen before. The story over on solar is similar. Solar PV prices have been dropping substantially over the past 5 years, and meanwhile installed capacity has been exploding, even here in the South, and things are just now beginning to heat up. In North Carolina, they're anticipating installing 300 megawatts of solar in 2014 and nearly as much next year. Georgia will go from about 20 megawatts of solar in 2012 to over 715 megawatts of solar by the year 2016. TVA is going to have 215 megawatts of solar by the end of this year, and TVA will also have a total 430 megawatts of solar by the end of 2016. So we have some major solar activity going on within the region that just isn't captured in the EPA's current methodology, and so it's very important that these pieces of information get submitted into comments, that things are moving forward, projects are getting proposed and are getting built. And this slide just further shows that solar development is happening very rapidly across the residential, non-residential, and utility spectrum for solar projects. Meanwhile, solar installations are expected to continually increase while the prices continue to drop. These are factors, again, that are important to the UCS demonstrated approach because the past several years have been quite stellar for renewables. And in terms of the last informational slide that I have here, this is a great slide that we like to use. It's from an analysis firm called Lazard. They publish this every single year. This is the most up-to-date version of it. But what they've done is they've looked at all sources of new generation resources and found out what the prices are for those new generation resources. So if you look at wind down here, these prices that are quoted at wind for wind, these are not estimates. These are actual power purchase agreement prices for wind for the year 2013. So this is for the past year. Same thing for solar, for many of these other renewable resources. They do have some estimates in here for things like nuclear and also for carbon capture and sequestration. But generally, these numbers are actual, real reported numbers, and these are way better figures to use when talking about the cost of energy than the EIA numbers that are relied upon by the EPA. But as you can see here, energy efficiency is the lowest cost energy resource, quickly followed by wind, and then utility scale solar does compete currently with gas combined cycle and some other traditional resources. So with that, I hope I covered everything to everyone's satisfaction, but I will be turning it over to Angela.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Simon. That was a whirlwind through the renewable energy world. And so now we will go to energy efficiency, which was a nice lead off to say that this is the least cost option for states in terms of carbon reduction solutions. And I'm just going to go briefly through some of the high-level points in our recommendations and remind people to send in your questions and we will answer them. And we also have additional program staff ready to answer any questions you might have on these two clean energy topics. So here you'll see building block 4, right? Energy efficiency is what we're talking about. The cost of efficiency for the proposed goals, so once again, like renewable energy efficiency has these proposed and alternative goals. The proposed goal is 1.5% for the states. This is assumed a $275 per megawatt hour cost. For first year costs, you'll see the levelized cost there is much in kilowatt hours is only $0.0275. Energy efficiency, primarily there's more upfront costs in the first years, and then those costs reduce as the measures carry over through the years, and you continue to see savings with lower costs in the years after your first investment. The program levelized costs range from about 3 to 4.5 cents a kilowatt hour in 2017 to 2022, and this is as states ramp up to achieving that 1.5% savings. And the levelized cost is only about 4.5 cents per kilowatt hour for the remaining years up to that 2030 goal that states have to meet. So the question we pose is, can we achieve this 1.5 and even higher to 2% savings with energy efficiency in the Southeast? And the answer is yes, with an exclamation point and underlined. Currently, our IOUs are only achieving about 0.16 to 0.80% of savings, which is very, very modest. The Duke, Carolinas, Georgia Power, and TVA, to name some specific utilities, are all achieving savings for less than 0.02 cents a kilowatt hour, so pretty cheaply. Recently, a Georgia Tech and Duke study found that energy efficiency could eliminate the load growth that's predicted from 2010 to 2030, which would result in a cumulative sales reduction of 16% by 2030. which is actually more than what EPA's current state EE goals in the Clean Power Plan get states to in 2030. So like renewable energy, EPA's estimates of the potential for energy efficiency to reduce carbon emissions in the Southeast is woefully low. And here you can see that additional action is required by our Southeast state utilities above business as usual. So this chart shows that the cumulative savings in 2029 based on what utilities were doing in 2013 are lower across the board than what EPA's goal is in 2029, 2030. So state utilities, in order to get the least cost compliance option for the Clean Power Plan, really need to ramp up these energy efficiency programs. So these recommendations come from, are looking at what's happening in the EE and is being ever refined as EPA continues to release guidance like the recent NOTA that Simon mentioned. So currently, what we're recommending is that we need to adopt EE goals that ramp up to 0.25% a year, which is greater than what EPA is calling for now, so that the final rule should achieve 2% incremental energy efficiency savings. These energy efficiency compliance options should include building energy codes as a compliance option, so include programs that actually residents benefit from as well. EPA must also refine the cost assumptions in there. So just like we heard from Simon with renewable energy, the cost assumptions in the current draft Clean Power Plan do not accurately reflect the present day data and information. So one specific recommendation is the current participant to program cost ratio that EPA has included in the draft needs to be refined, and included information such as the fact that in 2014 we're already showing that $230 per megawatt hour is the first year cost. So it's actually reduced costs from what EPA is assuming. Another big issue that we've heard kind of across the board is that EPA needs to provide guidance to states on measurement and evaluation of energy efficiency savings. So currently each state in their own state energy offices has their own energy measurement and valuation criteria, and in order for that to be uniform, EPA needs to give states that guidance so that states aren't left guessing at how energy efficiency savings will play into their state compliance plans. So that wraps up energy efficiency, and we wanted to leave enough time for discussion because I'm sure a lot of people have questions. One thing that I want to emphasize here at the end, this webinar is focused on how you can get involved, and they're actually, one of the best parts about the Clean Power Plan is there are actually a lot of bites at the apple, both as EPA is finalizing the rule, and then afterwards as states dig into how best to create their compliance plans to meet the final EPA emission rate goals for each state. So as we talked about, the current public comment period is still open on the rule, the draft proposed Clean Power Plan. That deadline ends December 1st. EPA actually extended that deadline after hearing from a lot of stakeholders that it's a rather complicated rule, and so they want to give the best input possible, so they needed more time to dig into all the documents. So now it's December 1st. I've included links in here, and we will make this webinar accessible afterwards so that you can actually just click on the links. But the first one is a landing page on our website for all the information on the EPA rule itself, and then the second one are draft letters that we've made focused on several key areas that we think EPA needs to hear comments from in order to make the final Clean Power Plan as strong as possible, both in terms of carbon emissions reductions and then also incentivizing clean energy solutions for states for low-cost options, as well as helping to grow a clean energy economy, which is very much needed in the Southeast. So that's what you can do before the public comment period is closed, but I want to stress that it's not over after that. We've heard a lot of pushback from conservatives and utilities on this rule that they can't comply, it's a job killer, kind of pick your argument. But what we need from those who support the Clean Power Plan is just as strong of a voice. These are not expensive rules. The cost benefits for the public health will greatly outweigh any of the costs. Utilities can do these compliance measures at a lower cost than some other high-risk energy solutions they've chosen in the past. And so it's really important not only to let EPA know, but then to talk to your state regulators, your state politicians, because they will begin to have a very real role when it becomes a time for states to make their plans. And states has already begun to talk to states that we work with about this, so they're already beginning to look into this. So it's never too early to engage and let your state know that you want clean energy solutions as part of the Clean Power Plan. The state compliance plans, as you saw earlier, will begin to be submitted to EPA, who has to approve them. Beginning in 2016, each state actually has to hold a public hearing on their state plans as part of the Clean Power Plan requirements. So states will keep everybody updated when that happens, but also just keep your ears out, because that's a great opportunity to actually speak to your state regulators on their proposed plan. Additionally, some of our states, the legislature gets involved and has to approve the plan. So those states include Florida, in some cases, Tennessee, South Carolina. And so that will actually have a legislative role. So then that's when it's important to talk to your state representatives. Additionally, states has put together climate impact fact sheets that can be found via this link. And these are just fact sheets that are state specific that really highlight what we're seeing in terms of climate change effects in each state, so that we can really speak with a reality that this climate change is a real issue. Carbon emissions are majority come from coal plants. The Southeast is majorly coal dependent. So we really need to talk in a real way that we're seeing these impacts. We will continue to see them if we do not take some real action to curb those emissions. So with that, I think we are at the Q&A, and I believe Simon and Aaron, you will help figure out which questions we need to address.
Yes, I will. Yeah, Angela, I've been getting questions, and just a reminder to folks, if you do have a question, feel free to submit it through your control panel. Let's see here. Our first question we'll have from Lindsay Pace, and she says, isn't it already incorporated into the Clean Power Plan the ability to purchase renewable power from out-of-state resources? And Lindsay, great question. Based on our reading of it, no. The way the EPA has come up with this is they apply in-state generation of renewable energy and multiply it times a growth rate within that state. So, for instance, TVA is purchasing quite a lot of wind energy from out of state, but when looking at the EIA data that are used to come up with each state goal, those megawatt hours don't show up in Tennessee. They show up in the states where the wind farms actually exist. And so it's important that those types of resources be credited properly to the utilities that are actually purchasing the power. And this is kind of a fundamental question of, can states basically purchase renewable energy credits from anywhere in the country? And our position at this point is that if a utility or if a state is receiving delivered power from a renewable energy resource, that they should be credited for that. And so that way we're not in a purely wholesale REC market where Georgia could purchase RECs out of California and never expect to receive any of that power. But great question, and it's really important that we try to get this right. So make sure you put that into the EPA comments. This next question I'm going to tee up for Sarah Barzak. Sarah works on our nuclear side of things. So Aaron, if you want to start getting Sarah prepped, and Sarah, if you want to get prepared. The question comes from Patricia Pierce. The question is, in South Carolina, new nuclear was counted as in our base number. Some folks would like to see our new nuclear generation count towards our state goal, but the concern is that that would eat up any room for growth of energy efficiency and renewable energy. Any thoughts on how to respond, and what is the balanced approach? Sarah?
Hi, this is Sarah. I think I'm unmuted now. Simon, can you hear me?
Yep, I can.
Okay, great. Thanks, Patricia. Currently, the EPA treats the 3 states with under construction nuclear, so that's Georgia, South Carolina, and Tennessee, as follows. EPA includes the generation from these yet to be completed reactors that I think a lot of us are questioning whether they'll actually ever be completed in the computation of the BSER and the state emission goals, but it also allows those states to include that generation as a compliance option. So some of the state's complaints or some of the comments we're hearing aren't clearly describing the actual situation. Georgia Environmental Protection Division sent a letter to EPA in September on behalf of Georgia, South Carolina, and Tennessee requesting that the agency remove the under construction nuclear generation from BSER and state emission goals, but allow the new reactors generation, if they come online, to be used for compliance. So if that were approved, then yes, it would likely negatively impact the amount of renewable energy and energy efficiency that those states would invest in. If you want to find that letter, which I would encourage you to do, you can just go to, it's Georgia, like the state Georgia spelled out AIR, georgiaair.org, and click on Hot Topics, and then you just scroll down and you'll see all of the state of Georgia's 111D Clean Power Plan comments. There's a hyperlink in there, and then you'll find the September 16th letter. So I would suggest reading through that closely, and definitely in comments, people should request that those states' requests be rejected by EPA. I hope that helps.
Great. Thanks, Sarah. Let's see here. Angela, if you could check your chat for right now on the control panel. But to make things a bit more confusing, hey, Aaron, I'll be teeing up Natalie to talk about energy efficiency. So Natalie, if you want to get prepared. The question is, what costs?
Yes, Simon.
Yes.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Okay, so the question to Natalie is, what costs are included in efficiency avoided cost, capital costs avoided, utility loans are paid back? How could EPA have put out such flawed data?
Hey, this is Natalie. Simon, can you hear me?
I gotcha.
Okay, so the EPA used, based on research from LBNL and ACEEE, American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy, they used an average value of $270 per megawatt hour for their first year costs. This is a very conservative amount based on more recent reports from ACEEE, and the EPA acknowledges that in its proposal. So there's 2 components to the cost. One is the program administrator costs, which is the $275 per megawatt hour, and the second component is participant costs, which are the same amount. It's a 1-to-1 ratio that EPA assumes. So for every dollar that whoever is implementing the program puts in, the participant also puts in $1. So none of the components that were mentioned, such as avoided costs or capital costs, are evaluated by the EPA. These are just high-level analysis at looking at what the cost would be on a first-year cost basis and a levelized cost basis.
Great. Thanks, Natalie.
No problem.
Our next question here, are you seeing any examples of states being willing to submit joint plans as allowed by the EPA. What can we do to encourage states to submit regional approaches? Angela?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we do not know for sure if any of those states are planning that. That will, I guess, remain to be seen once states begin submitting comments after the public comment period is done, and then when they develop their plans. We have heard from some utilities, such as Southern Company, that they are interested in that approach. So EPA allows either a multi-state, so just 2 states if they wanted, or a regional approach if a region, much like the Northeast has already done with the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, wanted to join together and really create a regional approach. But utilities like Southern Company that operate in Mississippi, Georgia, Alabama, and Florida, it's in their best interests, most likely, to do some type of a multi-state plan, since they have to manage generation resources across 4 states and deal with 4 different regulatory authorities. Additionally, costs can be shared for compliance, so costs like administrative costs of staff, working on the plan, and costs of actual generation resources sharing, so energy efficiency programs and different compliance options can actually be cheaper for each state if they share those costs among the states. So what I would recommend, there's not a tangible way to influence the states, rather than just speaking with them and learning more about what they may or may not want to do with their states. But one thing we will be including in our own comments is the support of EPA's inclusion of a multi-state approach, because we recognize that, especially in the Southeast, which utilities like Duke that own generation resources in South Carolina, North Carolina, and other states, and TVA that operates in 7 states, and Southern Company, like I mentioned, it's important to include that multi-state approach in the final Clean Power Plan. So we support and would suggest you supporting the inclusion of that approach in the final Clean Power Plan.
Great. Let's see here. We've got another question, and it's in reference to who gets credit for what is produced and where it's produced. So I'll do my best to answer this. But the question is, why shouldn't the state that produces get credit? A state who only buys renewable energy could close a carbon emitter and fill the demand with additional purchase. Would the purchaser not be credited with the reduction? So let me further explain what I was talking about earlier. So the way the EPA looks at it right now is they say, for renewables, they say, what can you generate inside the state? And we are in favor of in-state renewables as much as possible, but there is a really big opportunity as well to import renewable energy, specifically wind energy, from out of state, from out of the region. And so we need to make sure that EPA can incorporate that. And the reason why we know that opportunity exists is because the utilities are already doing it. So several utilities such as Alabama Power and Georgia Power and TVA are buying wind power from out of region, not just out of state, and we think they need to get credit for that. But alternatively, if someone wants to build a wind farm in Alabama or in Tennessee, we think whoever purchases that power should also get that credit. So if a wind farm gets built in Alabama and Alabama Power purchases that electricity, they need to get credit for it. If a wind farm were to get built in Alabama but sold to TVA, TVA needs to get credit for it. And TVA has a little bit of jurisdiction in Alabama, so it makes things a little bit more fun. So we're in favor of in-state renewable generation, but also making sure that whoever is purchasing that power does get the credit for it. And I hope that kind of clears it up. Next question we've got here, why does the Florida, and this is Angela for you, why does the Florida legislator have to approve the state's state implementation plan?
So that is a great question, and I'm not exactly sure why they have to. I just know that they have to. So various states have the requirement for some of these like state energy planning documents to go through a legislative process, and the states I outlined earlier are those states. if whoever asked this question wants to email me at the email on the screen here, we can kind of talk more offline and dig into maybe where that came from. But my guess is that a while ago, the states that have the legislation approval process enacted a law that required this type of energy planning or federal, I guess, state resource planning has to go through a legislative process. So that's my best guess right now without knowing the legislative history of each of our southeastern states.
Thanks, Angela. Next question we've got, for North Carolina, the lawsuit filed in February defends credits for actions already made by Duke. How will that outcome affect the plan? Do you think this credit request is applicable or appropriate to the purchase credit? It's in reference to the Diener letter that was sent to EPA earlier. Angela, do you want to take a first stab at this?
Yeah, so I think what I'm hearing, the question is that several southeastern states joined a rather premature lawsuit. You said lawsuit, right, Simon?
Yes.
Yeah, a lawsuit against EPA saying that the way that the proposed Clean Power Plan is laid out is unfair. Number one, because it chooses 2012 as a baseline, and many states have taken measures to reduce carbon before 2012. First of all, just as the lawyer in me feels the need to point out that it's pretty premature to challenge a rule that's not final yet. There will be plenty of opportunities for legal challenge after the rule is finalized by EPA in June. So a little bit of what we're seeing with these lawsuits are just political posturing. It's not my belief that these will actually lead to a successful legal challenge that would affect the rule before it is final. But in terms of whether or not states should get credit for actions taken before 2012, that's an issue that EPA has open for comment while the rule is still in draft form. Recently in the NOTA, which they just released a couple weeks ago, they proposed yet another approach, which is to allow states to include an average of 3 years around 2012 and use that as their emission baseline. So the idea there is that you are incorporating some of those actions that were taken around 2012, and these actions could be retiring coal plants, which we know a lot of utilities have done because of low natural gas prices and not necessarily because they believe in reducing their emissions. But I think it's what we're kind of thinking about now that we're having to digest the NOTA is that states, I think an average is okay. I think there's some caveats to that we can talk offline about that get really into the weeds. But basically, states do get credit for what they've done in the sense that those generation resources or energy efficiency measures will continue into the compliance period and will continue to count as lower emission sources that are averaged into the state's emission rate reductions. And also, for example, in Duke and North Carolina, North Carolina is the only state in our region that has a renewable portfolio standard, and they are getting credit for that, and are actually, the state that's kind of serving in the proposed approach as a benchmark for the rest of our states. So I think it's a little misleading to say that states aren't getting credit for what they're doing. They are, and if they continue to invest in those options, they will get even more credit going into the compliance period.
Thanks, Angela. And here's our last question. What about the value of sharing resources as per ISOs or RTOs? Is that not available because we're all in regulated states? And this is actually kind of a really astute observation. When Angela was answering a question earlier about a state-by-state approach or a regional or a multi-state approach that EPA is, again, putting out for comment, one thing really to keep in mind is I think a regional approach makes an awful lot of sense for states in the Mid-Atlantic and the Northeast that have joined the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. These are RGGI states, and they're already working together to reduce carbon emissions. So in that sense, they already have a regulatory framework to deal with carbon emissions, whereas many of the other states throughout the country just don't have that process. And so I think you're more likely to see a regional approach in RGGI states than what you would here in the South. And in part, it's because we don't have regional transmission organizations. By and large, we don't have regional transmission organizations, and we don't have independent system operators. So throughout the South, in North Carolina, the PJM RTO dips slightly into North Carolina. PJM also covers quite a bit of Virginia. And then also in Arkansas and Louisiana, they have now recently joined MISO, which is the Mid-Continent System Operator. And within those areas, it could make sense for them to join some sort of regional effort within their RTO or ISO region. But for by and large, most of our other states, they still own their generation and their transmission capacity. So if you go to Florida, the generators in Florida also own the transmission. So it would make it difficult for them to couple their emissions reduction plans with, say, a nearby state like Georgia, where most of the generation is owned by Georgia Power. So I think that's a very astute observation in explaining why maybe we're not hearing so much about regional plans or multi-state plans here within the South.
Yeah, and Simon, if I could just kind of add real quickly on that. So as Simon said, we don't have an RTO or an ISO. We have, the states obviously do talk to each other in some sense because, like we said, we have generation resources that span states amongst utilities. So these conversations are happening. It's just that they're not happening and have been happening for years. They're just not happening in a formalized ISO RTO framework. There is a Southeast Regional Transmission Planning Group that talks to each other. And so to the extent that the states already talk to each other about transmission planning, there is opportunity for them to just build off of that, although not as easily as the areas like Simon was mentioning that already have those formalized RTOs and ISOs. So it is a bit of a challenge, but because of all the multi-state utilities we have, it's not as if these people have never met each other and aren't talking to each other. So I just kind of wanted to put that clarification there.
Great. Thanks, Angela. Well, with that, I think we are out of questions, so I'll turn it back over to Erin to close us out.
Great. Thanks, Simon. Thanks, Angela, and everybody for joining us today. Today's presentation has been recorded, and it will be available on the webinar archive page of our website. We will send you a link to that recording once it has been processed, and that will most likely be early week next week. We appreciate your support and interest and hope that you'll join us again. Thanks.